Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a new lecture in our spring series of public lectures. My name is Adriana Bara, and I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Eastern Orthodox Studies. Before I introduce today's lecturer, Dr. Michael Hjälm, please let me explain how we will proceed. Dr. Hjälm will present his lecture for about an hour. Then we will have a 30-minute session of questions and answers. I invite you to write your questions in the chat box. I will mediate the discussions and present your questions to the lecturer. And please keep your microphone muted for the entire session. Thank you. I have the privilege and pleasure to introducing our lecturer today, Dr. Michael Hjälm. He earned his master's and doctorate in theology from the University of Uppsala, and his research interests are in ecclesiology. He's especially interested in how sociology of the church can help us understand the way the church organizes itself. He believes that this can help us find ways to integrate church organization and canon law with sociology and political science. Dr. Hjälm is a senior lecturer in Eastern Christian Studies at Stockholm School of Theology, Dean of St. Ignatius Foundation, and Dean of St. Ignatius Folkhögskola. Since 2019, he is also the Dean of the Department of Eastern Christian Studies at Stockholm School of Theology. Dr. Hjälm has presented an impressive number of lectures and conferences covering a wide variety of subjects, and some of them have been published. He also published articles, reviews, and 2 books, one in Swedish. He published it in 2003. The title in English is The Truth, the Good, and the Beauty, an Educational Journey. And the second book in English in 2011, entitled Liberation of the Ecclesia, the Unfinished Project of Liturgical Theology. In his lecture today, he will speak about the Church as an Imperial Republic and beyond. Welcome, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Bara. In this lecture, I will try to highlight the understanding of a church as a political entity. But I don't mean by political here, just a kind of, ideological entity, but what it means to exist in the world. And hopefully the conclusion will be to understand a challenge, or the challenge that the churches are now facing in the 21st century. I will use a key point in order to show you my lecture's content, so to say. So, the lecture's name is The Church as an Imperial Republic and Beyond. Let us begin with the concept of church here. The concept of church has its roots and origins, I would argue, in the Jewish synagogue. The structure of a Jewish synagogue had an archysynagogos, presbytery, and diacony, which was the Greek structure of a synagogue, which spread in the time of Jesus or the early church, so to say. The church more or less took over this structure, and instead of having an archysynagogos, they had an episcopos, but they still have a council of elders, the presbytery, which we call priests today, and servants, diacony. But they also changed the name synagogue to ecclesia. And it's interesting to see the roots of this ecclesia to understand how the church emerged in the world, so to say. There has been a lot of articles dealing with how this happened and the reasons for it. And it can be discussed in what way it entered into the awareness of a church, so to say. But one of the strongest roots of this concept comes from the concept of democracy. This is the pnyx in Athens. This is actually literally the cornerstone of the Athenian democracy. This was the place where the citizens of Athens gathered to take decisions. The most famous quotation used for this let's see. So the most famous quotation is taken from Pericles' funeral oration, where he says that our polity does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a pattern to others than imitators ourselves. It is called a democracy because not the few but the many govern. If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. If the social standing, advancement in public life falls to reputation for capacity, class, considerations, not being allowed to interfere with merit. Nor again does poverty bar the way if a man is able to serve the state. He is not hindered by the obscurity of his condition. It's taken from Thucydides with this funeral oration, so to say. The height of Athenian democracy could be located to the 5th century before Christ. And it coincides more or less with Pericles' funeral oration. And the concept ecclesia, or ecclesia, was simply the name of Athenian assembly. It differs from our normal concept of parliament because the members of Athenian assembly were not elected, but they attended by their right as citizens. All citizens were allowed, at least in the first democracy, to attend the ecclesia. And around the assembly, there were officials which created a complex structure for the society. It seems like the early church turned towards this idea that all members of a church, all members of ecclesia, participated in the decisions. And this was emphasized in understanding of the way the church should be run in the early beginnings. There's also another interpretation, simply that this is a Greek concept corresponding to the so-called quorum that was used in Hebrew, and not the word, but the quorum that was taken to mean that if 10 adult male were present, then the holiness were present also in the gathering. But surely, ecclesia had a strong meaning for the early church relating to the Athenian assembly. The officials were sometimes elected, but in large part chosen by lottery. This also has some kind of bearing on how the apostles were elected according to the Acts, and also how patriarchs later on have been elected. This lottery also has a strong connection with the Athenian assembly. After restoration of democracy, close to the beginning of our era, they introduced the so-called red line in the Athenian democracy, simply saying that a maximum of 6,000 citizens were allowed to participate in the ecclesia. And when the quorum, so to say, was filled, they draw a line, a red line, or a red colored band, so to say, which signify that no more people were allowed to participate in the quorum for the ecclesia. This is a display of the so-called complex structure of a second Athenian democracy. And up in the center, you see the popular assembly, the ecclesia, where the ecclesiasts, so to say, up to 6,000 were allowed to participate, which were the quorum for the Athenian democracy. One has to be clear that citizens were not even a third of all population. First of all, you had to be male. Women were excluded from this. Secondly, you had to be someone born in the third line of parents and grandparents in Athens. And then also youths were also excluded from the Athenian ecclesia. Now, the first democracy suffered from several internal problems, which were evident already when Pericles had his funeral oration. And the end of the first Athenian democracy coincided by the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404. This war ended with the victory of Sparta, which led to the coup, where Plato's family was involved. Though not Plato himself, but his family was involved in this coup, where there was an uprising against the democracy, because there was a general or a broad layer of people who questioned the democracy and wanted a stronger leader and a better way of ruling their society. That's where Plato appeared with his book Politeia, around 375 before Christ, or which is translated into English into Republic, so to say. And this is the manuscript, the earliest manuscript we have of a republic. It's from the 9th century. His vision, Plato's vision, was the beautiful city, the so-called Polis. Polis was intended to be the ideal society, where happiness prevailed as a kind of justice, where his argument in his famous book Republic is that it's always better to be just than unjust. The words come from Socrates, who was used as a kind of, in this case, a kind of alter ego for Plato's own philosophy. And happiness, eudaimonia, depends on virtues in Plato's Republic. And this has a consequence of Plato's way of understanding political steering, or the polity, that it's a virtuous society which is conditioned on the soul of people. So happiness in the Republic, that's a condition of the soul, an ontological condition. It's something that is inherent in people, which makes them able to guide others and rule others. And this highlights also that personal virtues, instead of rights and laws, came in focus in Plato's Republic. And this has a long bearing consequences for our understanding of the political structure of the future of society. Because when he focused on the virtues and the virtuous society, it meant that laws, justice as such, and rights were not in the center, but instead the rulers, the person. It was more important for Plato to display the character of a person who was a ruler than the actual acts of ruling. And that had the consequence for Plato, the end result of a need of a philosopher king. His view of a perfect society was a virtuous leader and a people who developed their characters, their virtuous characters, which transcended their laws and rights. Against Plato appeared a disciple to Plato, Aristotle. He articulated a quite different view of the polity. For him, happiness, eudaimonia, is not merely a condition of the soul. It's not merely an ontological condition, but a kind of right activity. Meaning that for him, he created already from the beginning in his philosophical work a dialectic relationship between the ontological character of a person and the practice in society. And he understood this, that they could not be fully mediated. There has to be a distinction all the time. So the good lives, therefore, for Aristotle was the rational activity of the soul as guided by virtues, but also that were effected in the right activity. And the interesting thing, it's not an individual right activity only that Aristotle is focusing on, but the interchange between citizens and the effect the interchange creates. This created a different perspective than Plato in understanding the perfect society or the perfect polity, so to say. So the dialectic between condition of a soul and the ethical practice created also a dialectic between power and interests. And this is maybe the most important part of how Aristotle developed his view of a society. Was this evolved into a constitution? This is the constitution, as you see on the picture here, that Aristotle developed in his works, which is quite complex. It takes a PhD to understand all parts of this. But in principle, I would argue it's not so difficult. He identified various types of ruling. The first rule is by one person in the interest of all, and that is for him monarchy. The second is ruled by one person in his own interest, which he deemed as tyranny. The third is ruled by a minority in the interest of all, and that is aristocracy. And then ruled by a minority in the interest of itself, and that was deemed as oligarchy by Aristotle. And then ruled by a majority in the interest of all is polity. And finally, ruled by the majority in the interest of themselves is democracy. As you can see here, his view of democracy is not positive. For him, democracy for him was a mob ruling. That was the majority who ruled only for themselves, even if they were a democracy. This way of understanding democracy came back during the 19th century by Lord Acton, who was one of the fathers of common rights for citizens in a society. This definition of democracy was not taken over by the followers of Aristotle later on, but it highlights that he viewed monarchy as something that he preferred, and next best was aristocracy, meaning it's better to have an enlightened monarch than having democracy, which is a mob rule. But, and this is important, and many are missing this when they are reading Aristotle, though he argued very clearly, since monarchy and aristocracy have a strong tendency to devolve into tyranny or oligarchy, Aristotle argues that in practice, polity is to be preferred. So strongly preferred that he actually named his vision of the society polity. because the practice differed from the ideal society in his work. This is dialectic situation that Aristotle created, that you can have a perfect theory, you should have, but the practice will evolve into something different. This is something that marks the difference between Plato and Aristotle in many ways. This created a kind of two cities. First, we have the Plato's Republic. Plato's Republic was an ideal society run by an enlightened ruler or a group of rulers that was more important for him, the so-called philosopher's rule. Simply, competence, illumination, enlightenment, these are the ideas that should characterize the leaders of the polis, of a society. And then we have Aristotle's Republic, or polity, where he argues that the society should strive towards ideals, but the activities, the right activities, has to be considered on their own as practices. And power has a tendency to destroy ideals. Therefore, practice must have a separate part in determining which society would be the best. Later on in history, and now we're coming close to church history, another figure developed the idea of two cities, and that was Augustine of Hippo. Augustine, who became the major church father in the Latin West, he developed the idea of two cities. And here's a manuscript of his book, Civita Dei, which is one of the cities, and the Civita Terrena, that is the other city. Civita Dei was a city that was characterized by the same ideas as Plato, while Civita Terrena was the evil counterpart, so to say. Let's look at this Civitas Dei in Augustine's work then. First of all, as I said, it's based on Platonic ideals. And the first thing is that Civitas Dei is characterized by happiness is a condition of the soul. But it differs a little bit from Plato, because he connects happiness as a condition of the soul with memories. And that means that he identifies the activity of the soul as an intellectual activity. But in the same way as Plato, it doesn't need to have a direct activity in the empirical world. So it's enough to have it on the ontological side of a soul, but connected with memories for the sake of intellectual activity. So Augustine and Plato placed, therefore, happiness in the eternal realm, and therefore beyond human relations and practice. And it's clearly spelled out by Augustine that if it would be related to human relations and practice, the Civitas Dei would be relating to the internal interest of the fallen man, so to say. Therefore, he places this in an eternal realm. And the soul has an eternal destiny, and the memories, the anamnesis, so to say, has also a connection to this in eternal destination in them. And therefore, they share the same vision of a virtuous republic. So Civitas Dei, the city of God, is a virtuous republic. Not based on activities, but on the ontological condition of the citizens of a republic. Which demand, in the same way as Plato had the philosopher king, Augustine required a corporate personality, someone who could sum up all the good things that exist among humans. There's a huge discussion about who would be this corporate personality? Is it Christ himself, or is it the hierarchy of the divine city, so to say? So, one thing that is apparent in his work, Civitas Dei, is that he considers Civitas Dei as the only true republic in the universe, or the only true polity in the universe. Which means simply, for Augustine, that the vision is not extraterrestrial, so to say, which has been quite many books written about Civitas Dei as a heavenly kingdom, so to say. That's not the idea by Civitas Dei by Augustine. Instead, he believes that the Civitas Dei is the commonwealth of the good angels and communion of the saints. The commonwealth of the good angels and communion of the saints, which in exact is the church for Augustine. And those that belongs to this Civitas Dei are the elected ones, the Ecclesia. So here, the concept of church for Augustine is a concept of elected citizens of a divine city. A quotation here: a multitude united by the recognition of the law and the community of interests. A multitude united by the recognition of the law and a community of interests. Or another quotation: a multitude of reasonable beings voluntarily associate in the pursuit of common interests. Anyway, and necessary condition for Augustine in this is that this Civitas Dei is mystically united with the Eucharist. This is where a lot of, let's say, popular books has developed an idea that Augustine's Civitas Dei would be something that doesn't exist in the empirical world, or at least it hasn't no connection to our society. It's quite the contrary. Augustine's Civitas Dei is spatial. It requires space. It's not an extra earthly thing. It connects heaven on earth, but it is located to the space here on earth. It is a spatial divine city, or city of God. And it also has necessary geopolitical relations. And this is actually a perception of a church that then later on emerged within the Catholic circles. The church has space and geopolitics. So, based in the understanding of Augustine, we find that the ecclesiology that emerged from this is a spatial and geopolitical ecclesiology. It is a kingdom in this earth which is identified. It is the invisible church, the triumphant church, Ecclesia Triumphans, visibly present in the militant church, Ecclesia Militans. So there is an invisible part of the church, but it coincides with the visible, spatial, and geopolitical church on earth. So then he contrasts this with Civitas Terrena, which is the other city. Civitas Terrena is a city that doesn't exist in its own terms, but is a corruption of the Civitas Dei. And by saying so, it means that for him, there is only one true city, so to say, and that's Civitas Dei. While Civitas Terrena is a corruption that destroys itself in the very long run, following the arguments by Augustine. Civitas Terrena is a city that those who belongs to it has freely chosen sin. And they are driven by private interest, and the primary among those are the lust of dominion. And by their misguided virtues will use their intellect for a different goal that is incapable of reaching unity. This means that Civitas Dei is not the ideal existence contrary to Civitas Terrena. No, it's the only possible existence in the long run. That's why it's important for him that it's spatial and geopolitical, which is often interpreted in a different sense, I would argue. This created during the Middle Ages a kind of fortress Catholicism up to the, I would argue, up to the Second Vatican Council. This fortress Catholicism meant that the spatial and geopolitical church needed to have borders to protect itself, to be different from the world of its Civitas Terrena, which surrounded the Civitas Dei, the Catholic Church and its hierarchy, and its geopolitical hierarchy, and the space or spatial existence they had in the church. The church state was, in this instance, very important in the Middle Ages. It provided the argument for the spatial church, and the geopolitical situation developed continuously over the timeline. And today we have nuncios, which are political representatives for the Vatican in various countries, and they have an independent representation outside our political entities, so to say. This was way up to Vatican II, that this fortress Catholicism was emerging and existed. The great change with Vatican II is not all the, the ideas of liberal theology, which has been, advocated. And in fact, it's not so liberal, I would argue, as many tend to believe the Vatican II to be. But it is the twist in understanding the spatial and geopolitical church. But it's not that they abandoned the spatial church or the geopolitical church. It's rather it was given a new practice. Globalization created a new type of international relations, which made the church able to uphold its spatial and geopolitical characters in a new way. And that began already before Vatican II, but it really exploded after Vatican II with a new set of understanding international relations, which we call today public diplomacy. It meant that the church, instead of focusing on owning the information, using certain channels which would not be allowed to intervene from external forces, secret papers and messages, so on, that we know from spy movies and so on. The Roman Catholic Church was one of the first religious communities who turned to public diplomacy by saying, instead of owning the message, let our information be public for everyone, so we can hold the mainstream of media and interest of media for the Catholic Church. Radio Vatican and everything was part of this huge strategy that formed the new practice of a spatial and geopolitical church of Roman Catholicism. So basically, the Roman Catholic Church turned towards public diplomacy in order to continue to exist as a spatial and geopolitical entity. developing advanced diplomatical structure with nunciatures in various countries, having ambassadors at the Holy See, by educating a new core of diplomats in the Vatican, and also by highlighting the focus on the idea that all Catholics are part of this wide spatial and geopolitical entity that was called the Catholic Church. If we turn to East instead, we have a little bit different picture here. First of all, we have the concept of diocese or diocese. The Eastern Church quickly was integrated with the Roman Empire and adopted the civil structure of Roman Empire and became part of that with the spatial and geopolitical structure of empire. But it's very clear that the diocese was intended to coincide with the diocese or the administration of the secular empire. So the Eastern Church adopted the spatial and geopolitical structure of the empire instead of developing it as a separate structure on its own, with some small exceptions that I won't take today. Later on, when the Ottomans, when Constantinople fell in the hands of Muslim rulers in the middle of the 15th century, beginning then with the Ottoman rule in the 16th century, this spatial structure was changed into ethnos. So instead of having space or the spatial regional structure, instead the people became the carrier of a spatial existence, so to say. This had ramifying effects on the understanding of Eastern Church. It's going from a territory to an ethnical group creates completely new ways of thinking about the church that has an effect on the ruling, the effect on its self-understanding, and of course also on the practice of church. The Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople was identified as an ethnarch, the leader of a people, or an ethnos. And here we see Gennadios, who receives the right to continue with the so-called ecumenical patriarchate, or the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople, where he is embodied as a kind of leader of a people instead of a territory. So spatial became ethnos, and with this ethnos, we have a rise of a full concept what it means by ecumenical patriarch. Instead of talking about a territory, he's a patriarch of all Christians within the Ottoman Empire, or at least all Greek Orthodox Christians. But for the time being, he was even considered as an advocate for all Christians. This became a transcending ethnos, so to say. It was identified with a certain group, but in the robe of the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, ethnos became a transcendent identity. This continued in Russia with the same idea when the Tsar had the responsibility. Then it was located in a certain territory, but with the fall of the Soviet Union, we have a new ethnos identity with the so-called Ruski Mir concept, where the Russian world, or the Russian peace, the Pax Rusicana, has become identified with the people, not the territory, and the people that are spread in the ex-Soviet Union countries, where the Moscow Patriarch is the protector of his Russian people, which carries with it a certain world and a certain empire with a certain geopolitical identity and a spatial structure of the ex-Soviet Union. If you now go to the Reformed churches as a third movement, we can find that, first of all, we find in the Reformed Church that in the very beginning, a decentralized spatial and geopolitical existence. Reformation did not mean that they took away the spatial and geopolitical importance of a church. Lutherans were very clear that countries were turned into Lutheranism. Territories were turned into Lutheranism. Geopolitical structures were turned into Lutheranism. So it was not a change. What happened in Vatican II was more radical for the spatial and geopolitical existence of a church than what happened during the Reformation. But it was a decentralization. Instead of an empire, we find that the nation, the political nation, became was focused in the center. This is one of the German rulers, actually the first German ruler, which embraced the Lutheran faith, and he's given here the communion by Luther. And this picture was spread in the territory of, by the German ruler himself, simply that he was obedient to the church. Here, in the image of Martin Luther, where he, the mystical, the same idea as a mystical unity of this spatial and geopolitical church was connected with the Eucharist. And it was further emphasized later on, where Orthodox were allowed to exist if they accepted that it was not an Orthodox territory. This was a precondition in most of the negotiations between Orthodox and Lutherans. They were allowed to exist, but they had to accept that the territory that was Lutheran and not Orthodox. In the famous piece in Stalbova, and reading the annals by the Bishop of Västerås here in Sweden, we find that this is part of the absolute conditions for the Orthodox to be accepted with their own services. But Catholics in the early days of Reformation here in Sweden, for example, were not allowed at all in the Lutheran territory or the evangelical territory, which is the official status that was proclaimed in this promulgated laws. Actually, until 1952, or up to 1952, we still find the idea of a Lutheran space, the spatial Lutheran church in Sweden. It didn't change until 1952 in Sweden, which is interesting. It means that up to 1952, one could say that still the Lutheran self-conception was that Sweden was a Lutheran territory. The first movement that actually really abandoned was the Baptist in some sense, but the Pentecostal movement radically abandoned the spatial and geopolitical existence of the church. This is where we have maybe the strongest Reformation when we consider the spatial and geopolitical church today. This is interesting because I would argue that there are indications that abandoning the spatial and geopolitical existence in the wake of globalization has proven to be very successful. And the Pentecostal has increased the number of members, but it's important to see that members are not important in as such as members of a territory for the Pentecostal movement. No, it's the reception of the Spirit that is in the center. And it's actually an act against the spatial and geopolitical existence of the church, which should be of interest for more research and reflection. Yeah. So when we move towards the current battle, we come close to my conclusion here. And let's begin with, it's not about space. The current battle is not about, conquering each other's territories anymore. In the wake of global public diplomacy, new structure of international relations, and so forth, we have completely new battle, which is much more, I would say, interesting, but much more difficult to predict the outcome of this battle. It's the survival of spatial and geopolitical ecclesial entities. It's the survival of spatial and geopolitical ecclesial entities. This is, I would argue, for many churches of historical importance, to be spatial and geopolitical is how they survive. It's how they have survived through history. If we lose that ground, its spatial and geopolitical existence, it will jeopardize its very existence as a community. Catholics maintains the hierarchy for the geopolitical space. Still, the hierarchy is most important for Catholics to maintain the geopolitical space of the church. This is proven quite successful in the beginning when Radio Vatican and so on, the beginning of the public diplomacy started. The problem that they face is the participation of laity. For participation of laity, the village, the countryside, the region is important, which is much harder to preserve in a globalized and multicultural society. So still the hierarchy is quite important for the Catholics. And this is the beginning of the Catholic era, where they were riding on the waves of this new way of articulating their existence. And this meeting is symbolized between Ronald Reagan and John Paul II, shows the importance of being a separate entity, a separate geopolitical entity in the tides of our present more modern society. Yeah. Lutheran and Anglican, they struggle for a spatial existence, which has become hard in a multitude of nations and a multitude of groups in various societies. Since they don't have a hierarchy, a worldwide hierarchy that can support this, it means that they are struggling for a survival in a new world that is difficult to handle, so to say. Many Lutheran and Anglican churches has lost their prerogative of being the nation church, so to say, and to find the spatial and geopolitical existence in a new world is quite difficult. And we see that these churches that have a spatial and geopolitical foundation from history has a hard time to survive in the times of tomorrow. Orthodox struggle in a very unique way. We have two sides in this struggle. We have I would say, the ecumenical patriarchate side, where they try to imitate the Roman Catholic Church by creating a kind of hierarchy which transcends the various nations. And then on the other side, if we could take as an example, we have a nation churches in Orthodoxy that tries to preserve the prerogative of being the sole, or at least the major player in a local territory. It has a challenge. If you take, for example, Romania, it's quite harsh for the Romanian Orthodox Church. It's one thing if 10% returns Pentecostals, but when half or more than half turns Pentecostals, then it's a battle. And it's a battle about one church surviving as spatial and geopolitical church versus a church that doesn't play that game at all. I will take as a last example Uniting Church or Ekumenia kyrkan in Sweden. It will serve as an example of a church suffering in this battle of spatial and geopolitical survival of the church, so the survival of those churches. They have used in their development the organization as their spatial existence. And this is not so complicated to understand. They started as a kind of inner reformation of the Lutheran Church. And even when they broke from the Lutheran Church, they still lived in the shadow of his church. So it meant they identified themselves as an alternative to the state church. And that's how they have developed their existence in Sweden, as an alternative. But if the alternative is just one of many alternatives, if the state church is not the only alternative to the United Church, so to say, but there's a variety of existence, also Catholics, free churches, and so on, then the organization as their spatial existence seems to be too weak. And this is a church that suffers a lot in this struggle. So I would argue that if they would survive this battle, they need to exist on their own condition. And that's a condition that is hard to identify for a church that has identified themselves as an alternative to the Lutheran Church. I will end this by an interesting quotation by Lucia Nixon, not to be identified with the president, in her book where she is looking at how sacred space has changed during the decades. Quotation: "A sacred structure in ruins, in this case a church, sends a powerful message. It represents the visible disintegration of a particular landscape and a break in the continued communication of memory. Each church in sacred landscape of Slovakia is a particular node in a public memory network. If a church dies, then part of that network is gone. It is not just the church that will be forgotten, but the landscape as well. This restored and now refunctioning church has therefore been brought back to life, and the surrounding landscape has also in some sense been resuscitated." Lucia, when she was studying the decline of churches in Greece, she was interested to see what are the effects. And she argued in her book 2018, this is an article before, that the Greek culture is so spatial and geopolitical that it hardly can exist without that condition. And that's why it's threatened today. But she has a conclusion in her article, and that's that there is a third way which can be important for small Orthodox churches and some Catholic countries also. And that's the preservation of a very local church in its surrounding culture, landscape, and identities. But churches that doesn't have that integration with the landscape, but who still argues for a spatial existence or try to be a spatial existence, will suffer the consequences in the future. And I do believe that the alternative to spatial and geopolitical churches will be in the Pentecostal movement, where these conditions are cut in the very roots of its existence. Thank you so much for listening to this lecture.
Thank you very much, Professor Hjälm, for a very interesting presentation, very complex. You took us from philosophy to the church fathers and also in the ancient church and today's church. Thank you very much. I kindly invite you to write your questions in the chat box. And I will read your questions. I will transmit your questions to our lecturer. I will start with a question. Do you really think that Ruski Mir is a geopolitical entity, rather some kind of dream about some kind of proximity? Many people who speak Russian and try to have connection with Russia?
Yes, I think that both Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Constantinople and the Moscow Patriarchate are in its essence strongly attached to the spatial and geopolitical structure of the world. It means also that it becomes a conflict between these churches in real time, and not just about ideology. It affects countries like Ukraine, because it's a battle on the ground of its geopolitical and spatial existence. And it has very broad consequences also. People are dying because of this kind of conflict. And this is the same with the religious wars we have experienced in Europe. It's because of a spatial and geopolitical existence of the church. So I do think that Ruski Mir is not just a dream. It's an advanced tool to defend its geopolitical existence from the time, from the early days of the Russian height of its self-understanding.
Thank you. We have another question. Could one say that the idea of the Church of Sweden as a folkkyrka is an harangue to the idea of Sweden as a Lutheran country?
Absolutely, and I think the question it's almost like a hypothesis, and I would say that there's an interesting doctoral dissertation written by Kjell Blycket, The Nation as Church, where he identifies when the nation becomes church in Sweden. So it means that it's an interesting fact. It means that the geopolitical structure of society becomes the church. So the Lutheran Reformation didn't decrease the aspect of the geopolitical existence, but it actually increased it, I would argue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You mentioned both Reformed churches, Byzantine churches, and Catholic churches in your lecture. Churches with a clear connection to a state or nation. But where would you place the Syriac tradition, both West and East, that do not have that clear connection to an empire or state, but instead have always lived as a minority without any political support from state?
The Syriac Church is one of the main examples, I would say, for where the geopolitical existence, so to say, has been damaged so clearly. But there's also a special case because, and this is an interesting fact that Johan Andersson writes a paper on the Chimo tradition, where he argues that previous to this, the local village had their own traditions. So here we have the village as a spatial existence. We find the same idea in Greece, in fact, which Lucia Nixon studied. It's quite interesting to see that we have this village existence of a spatial identity, so to say, and or geopolitical identity, which is this is something for Syriac Orthodox to write the thesis about. That would be interesting, and Syria maybe will heed to finding some of these Syriac guys.
Mm-hmm. I have to tell you that there are many thanks messages for your interesting lecture. I will not read them all. I will read only the questions because we have only half an hour and I want to cover as many questions as possible. There is another question. How would you explain what is often believed to be the basic principle of orthodoxy, namely one bishop in one city. Is it really so basic, or it is just a geopolitical?
Oh, that has to be Cyril that makes that difficult question. um, it's a complex question. I would place the question in a kind of timeline, and I would say that this is a tentative answer. I'm not sure here. I would say that there's indications that one bishop in one city has been tremendously important in the early church as a kind of mark of the initial spatial existence of a church. So it's rooted very deep in the self-identity church. But when it develops into geopolitical, it means that suddenly it evolves, maybe it evolves naturally from within that spatial existence. So maybe the geopolitical side is, if I use Cyril's word, that's a scaffold of its spatial existence. So the geopolitical is a scaffold of its spatial existence. That could be the case, but I'm not sure. It's a difficult question too. That's something if it's Cyril that plays the question, I will have to discuss it later on.
Yes. You guess who asks questions only hearing the question. So
Yeah.
you have a good sense of your colleagues. I encourage you to send questions. This was the last question in the chat box, but we are still waiting for other questions. In the meanwhile, I would like you to explain a little bit your last thought on your lecture. That Pentecostal movements is a sort of an example of the future of the church. How would you develop a little bit this idea with which you finished your lecture?
The Pentecostal mode has a completely different ecclesiology. That's my conclusion by this lecture. They are not based on spatial geopolitical existence. They can develop it, of course, but then it's more an accident. That's a radical break with this. And it's rooted also in Methodist understanding, because Methodists also try to break it, but not in this radical sense as with the Pentecostals. That's why they can never accept territory of any importance. When they exist in Orthodox countries, it's completely irrelevant for them to hear about canonical territory. I would even say that's actually something that some Pentecostals would even argue is against the essence of a church. While I argue in this lecture, I try to highlight it, I do think that the spatial and geopolitical existence of a church is in some way connected with the essence of a church, to use this framework. It's how both Orthodox and Catholics understand themselves, but also Anglicans, Lutherans. The United Church is a special case. They are in between here in some sense. They have inherited the spatial understanding from Lutherans, but not in its full sense. So that's an interesting exception. But otherwise, Pentecostal ecclesiology is completely different, and there's no really good book that I have read about this in the last decade. So that's an interesting field to study.
How would you explain this partial heritage that the Uniting Church received from the Lutherans, referring to the special dimension of the church? Can you elaborate a little bit to understand how the church in Sweden is?
The founding father of United Church, Paul Peter Waldenström, when he was founding a parish in Jo in the southern part of Sweden, he had his appearances in the Lutheran Church in the beginning, and then he was forced to continue outside. But this displays a little bit how the United Church was working in the beginning as an inner reformation, or a close connected community to the Swedish Lutheran Church. So they didn't need a separate identity. Their identity was connected with the Lutheran Church. And this meant simply that they were the alternative. When the Lutherans didn't accept the members, the future members of Uniting Church, they left the church, but they didn't left it in their mentality. They were an alternative. So they never developed this territorial thinking, because that was connected with the Lutheran Church. And when I wrote an article on Paul Peter Waldenström, but it's interesting that he referred the spatial existence always to the Lutheran Church, not his own community. And this is probably the case with the United Church as a separate or individual example, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Somebody asked you, can you elaborate on the Coptic Church? How would you identify the Coptic case in relation to the nation in 20th and 21st centuries?
The Coptic Church is so closely identified with the land of Egypt, so one could not argue that they are not a spatial or a geopolitical church. They are closely related. The entire existence for the last long 20th and beginning of the 21st century is about the relations with the local political rulers, being the land of Egypt, the true Copts and the true Egyptians. They are prime example of its geopolitical, but they are more interested also because if you go back before the Council of Chalcedon 451, you can see that the bishops were great landowners, and they were their spatial existence was much stronger than the rest of the church. That's why they have a separate interest in the early church. There's one interesting book written by a scholar who is looking into this. It's not finished yet, but he will be finishing in, I think, this year, where he's looking at the geopolitical reasons for the conflict of 451, which I think is quite interesting.
Okay, thank you. Somebody invites you to differentiate between a rule by a majority in the interest of all is polity, whereas rule by the majority in the interest of themselves is democracy. Can you explain this? How would you differentiate between them?
This is the definition by Aristotle. He didn't believe in democracy, simply in the concept of democracy in those days, I would say, because he argued simply that democracy would mean a majority rule, while polity is an illuminated group of people that is ruling in the interest of everyone. And the interesting fact here is that for him, I would argue that for Aristotle, polity would be both the perfect theory and the perfect practice if you could find enough people illuminated to have the interest of all. He was quite hesitant about this. But when he concluded his work, he realized that even if I cannot find, enough people for this illuminated practice of polity, still it's better than having rulers turning into tyrants or a group of rulers turning into oligarchs. And I think Aristotle is interesting, a couple of 1,000 years later, if you look at how the situation is in post-Soviet Union, where we had this exactly in the effect. We have tyrants and we have oligarchs with the best of intentions in the beginning. The idea that they would rule their countries, with the best interests of all. This is where Lord Acton in the 19th century became very interesting when he says that power corrupts. It's not just enough to have good intentions as a leader. Power in itself corrupts. That's my conclusion when I look at history of the recent decades. Nobody can be safe from this, not even church leaders. So.
Another question, a very interesting question, is Father Afeverki asks you, how was the churches outside the territory of the Roman Empire organized? He means the diocese outside the Roman Empire.
I can take at least the Ethiopian and Eritrean churches. They were patterned after an imperial structure. Even if they were outside the Roman Empire for the majority of time, or the major part of its spatial territories, still the pattern was spatial and geopolitical. That's what characterized all these churches, both around the Roman Empire and inside the Roman Empire. We don't find exceptions in this time. I would argue that the real exception is with the Pentecostal movement and some historical movements which were eliminated during the time history, but that's another story. So
I would ask you which government of the church do you consider that is best? The Catholic model that you presented, the Orthodox within the Roman Empire, the Orthodox under the ruler of the Muslims, of the Ottoman Muslims, or the churches outside the Roman Empire, or the Pentecostal movement. Which do you think that is the best, in your opinion? Which is the best organized church?
Since I'm a scholar of social ecclesiology, I would interpret this, which is the most effective model. And that's not a single answer to this. The Pentecostal is clearly effective. To abandon the entire game of spatial and territorial existence, let's say, to just abandon it, it's proven. They are extremely successful. But if you accept the spatial existence of a church, which is motivated by the incarnation of theology, which is basic for both Catholics and Orthodox and Lutherans also, and I would argue also for Uniting Church, then its spatial existence has an importance. And if you look at the Catholic Church, they have been extremely successful in the latter part of, or the second part of the 20th century, by identifying itself with the Vatican II Council, by identifying itself not with the precise territory, but with the entire global world. They stepped into the very early waves of globalism and could ride on this and become very successful. Now we are in the age of different phase in globalization. And I do think that the Orthodox will suffer tremendously if we don't adapt. Because there's nothing in neither the ecumenical patriarchate strategy nor in the Russian strategy that will function in the long run. I don't think so. It will be hard to function. The Catholics will have a hard time to adapt to the idea of, lay influence and so on. That will also be problematic. I do think that small Orthodox churches and small Lutheran churches or Reformed churches could gain from this, what Lucia Nixon is saying, this local identity, local spatial identity, the village identity. But that's not for the big cities. And we know that globalization has a kind of urbanization. People are leaving the villages. I would say that there's with the exception of the Pentecostals, there is a kind of threat to Christianity based on the social analysis today. Christianity needs spatial existence, with one or some few exceptions, and that's interesting. And internally for the Orthodox Church, the challenge here is which line will they go for? The nation church, which I think is the prevailing existence. The nation is harder and harder to uphold. More and more plurality even in the Orthodox countries. Will they go for a kind of transcendent hierarchy? But then they will experience the same problems as the Catholics with lay participation and so on. There's no single solution here. Maybe there is something for the Holy Spirit to work with us on.
Very nice, thank you. Somebody asked you the monastery. Where do you find the place of monasteries as part of the structures of the church?
Is it Batikobena or is it some Ethiopia maybe? Just placing this question, I don't know. Anyway, Batikobena is writing an interesting doctoral thesis where he identifies paradise, or the spatial paradise on Earth in the beautiful surroundings of monasteries. And I think that his doctoral thesis is very much about, exactly about the spatial existence of a church, which I think is quite interesting. And this is the role of monasteries, to actually anchor the spatial church in a certain place through centuries, even millennia.
Very good, thank you. Another question: could we argue, in line with what you are saying, that the spatial and geopolitical dimension of the church is the only one accessible, that it is through this we can reach nature, and it is therefore the local church becomes important?
That was a complicated question. Can you take it once more?
Yes, Daniel asked you this question. So I will read it again if you want. Could we argue, in line with what you are saying, that the spatial and geopolitical dimension of the church is the only one accessible? That is through this that we can reach nature, and therefore to consider the local church most important.
Okay, if I try to interpret it in my way, and I interpret in lines with Cyril Haveroun's book on Scaffolds of a Church, I would say that the local church, in its particular gathering, 2 or 3 together in my name is Christ will be in the midst of us. That's the local spatial church, so to say. But it always evolves, I would say, into a geopolitical situation. And that happens in the liturgy after liturgy, I think, when people are relating to other communities. And that these relations create structures, which has meant that the local community was headed by one bishop. Naturally, I would argue, this is just a theory, so I wouldn't say that I've proven it. But naturally has evolved into larger territories, simply because of the inherent nature of a church to expand its territory, or at least the inherent nature of Christianity to expand its territory. And expanding territory can either follow the paths of secular warlords who conquer our territories. It can also be through networking, that a local parish connects with people in another city, and they create a local parish. And if you have a spatial understanding of church, it's natural that these relations has to be organized. So I would say then that the scaffold, if you use that understanding, the scaffold would be the networking, and the nature here would be the local assembly. And that could be a kind of answer to, was it?
Daniel, Thank you very much, Michael, for this wonderful lecture. And I'm very thankful that you finished the lecture by connecting your explanations with the presentation that we had previously with Father Cyril. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all who participated at this lecture. I would kindly invite you to be with us again on Thursday, March 4th, from 1 to 2:30 with Dr. Sarah Gerlin. She will be the lecturer on Thursday, March 4th. And the theme of her presentation will be conciliarism and democracy. So we are looking forward to another interesting lecture. Thank you, everybody, all. Thank you, Professor Hjälm, and all the best. And looking forward to see you again soon.